all for coming out this afternoon, or this evening. My name is Walid Hasboun. I teach international relations at the Political Science Department and also direct the Center for Arab and Middle East Studies, which is sponsoring this talk by Dr. Sami Hermez. I just want to make two announcements. One, for anybody who's not AUB, at the CAMES, the Center of Arab and Middle East Studies, we have an email list for events. If you're at AUB, you'll get them through the AUB lists. But if you want to join our email list, you can go to the CAMES website on the AUB website and send us a blank email. There's a link there to join our email list. The other thing is there was an announcement of a cancellation, but in case people didn't get this message, that Elliot Kola is not able to come. So we were going to plan an event on Friday, was originally announced, but then it was canceled. So I just want to people to understand that was canceled. So today we have Dr. Sami Hermez, who has a BA from Duke University, an MA from NYU, and a PhD in anthropology from Princeton University. He is taught at University of Pittsburgh, Mount Holyoke College, and at AUB as well, and is currently a visiting scholar in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University. He's had several publications in review of political and legal anthropology, cultural dynamics, and studies in ethnicity and nationalism. He's also been a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Lebanese Studies at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. So he's here to give a presentation on understanding dignity and political struggle in Lebanon and beyond. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Hermez.
So thanks everyone for coming. And thank you to the search committee for the opportunity to interview at AUB. Say that this is, although it's a job talk, it's really it's one of the first times I present on Lebanon in Lebanon, which is actually quite exciting for me. So one of the things that I'm looking forward to is actually the feedback, and hopefully there'll be some constructive discussion later on the topic of dignity, since you are pretty much all experts on this topic as well. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to begin with a brief outline of my overall research agenda to give you a broad scope of things, and then go into the specific topic of dignity. So my broader anthropological research is concerned with roughly three main questions, as I'm going to break them down to you today. First, how does violence impact people's everyday lives? And joined to that on a conceptual level, I'm concerned with how notions of state, security, and law are articulated and constructed in and through processes of war, political violence more generally, and really the invisibilities of violence. And to this end, I have a book project called The War is Coming, Living Every Day in Anticipation of Political Violence in Lebanon, where I'm really in this book, which is based on the dissertation research, where I worked with former militia fighters, political activists, artists, filmmakers, and really society at large between 2005 2009 in different parts of the country. So during the 2006 war and after in the south, and in the north for a few months during the war in Nahr al-Barid, but also in and around Beirut, where I was looking at sort of the sensation of the coming war, waiting, hope, anxiety, uncertainty. And the entry point to my dissertation, anthropologists are often proud of the fact that we are able to sort of let our lines of inquiry develop through the process of conversations and experiences with the people. And so my entry point to this work actually starts after the war in 2006. I was at Roadster Cafe a few streets away from here with an interlocutor of mine who I'd met a few weeks earlier. And we were sitting and basically waiting for our burgers. And she turned to me and says to me, Sami, our lives are like superhero comic strips. You know, where you have on one box the superhero is fighting, and then the next box says, in the meanwhile? Well, that's us. We live in the meanwhile. In the meanwhile, while people are fighting, We are at Roadsters having a burger. We get on with our everyday lives in the meanwhile of this war. And so this was sort of the kind of the entry where war wasn't so much the focus as much as it was how we wait for war and live in anticipation of war. And the book, basically, in the book, I'm looking at anticipation through three perspectives: the temporal, the political, and the material. In the temporal, where I'm looking at anticipation in and through time, in duration, how the future and the past are connected in the present. Sort of the way we anticipate future war is very much connected to the way we remember past wars. And the political, where I'm considering how people's political positions and affiliations and their identity play a role in how and when we anticipate war. So you often anticipate being safe or being a target depending on subjective considerations, like your politics or identity, whether sect, class, etc. And the material, where I look at material formations of this anticipation in objects like checkpoints, political speeches, advertisements, graffiti. So I'm looking at how different actors manipulate our sense of anticipating violence through certain objects. And so then I take some of these things as also to look at sort of critiques of memory. And critiques of the idea of la ghalib la maghlub, no victor, no vanquished. So speaking to reconciliation in that sense, or critiques of reconciliation. The second broad question is, how can we begin to understand perpetrators of political violence? So, in a sense, my overall research revolves around sort of thinking about different ways of thinking through political violence and its impact on everyday life. So in this case, how can we begin to understand perpetrators of violence? How do they understand themselves? How do we understand them? How do we live together in a society where you have perpetrators of political violence and, I guess, non-combatants? Here I'm working on a second book project as well, so I'm not working on it yet, but it will be a second book project, because what happened with my dissertation, the research for it was so rich and dense that I ended up with this really, almost too long dissertation, which was 2 volumes. And I realized that when I came to convert it into a book, that this stuff was, really, there was 2 things going on here. And so I pulled out all this work with the former fighters, my ethnographic and sort of interviews, ethnographic work and interviews with former fighters, and want to explore this or sort of look at this material more carefully and think about questions of reintegration, dehumanization in wartime, gendered militant participation, and motivations for continued political mobilization. So this is, I have 2 chapters from this already developed. The third question, which is the one I'm going to focus on today, is how do people mobilize in times of violence and instability? Now, of course, the questions overlap and the topics overlap, but for the purposes of the talk, kind of set them out like this. So I'll get to this in a moment, but together this research forms the foundation of my developing corpus that's invested in how various forms of political violence translate into people's everyday lives and everyday security. And it's part of a larger interdisciplinary study in the social sciences to study insecurity, crisis, precarity, and forms of political violence. And I hope that this line of inquiry, or these lines of inquiry, can lead to a better understanding of the world we live in, so as to produce connections and solidarities between people in an effort to struggle more effectively against injustice and oppression. And really, that's sort of the motivation of my overall research, trying to put my work to the service of thinking about injustice. So today, today I'm going to give you one example of this work, which is on dignity, which emerges out of the dissertation. And I thought that it was especially timely because it shows you how study of Lebanon can inform our understandings of larger regional issues and events. The work itself is interdisciplinary in the sense that Besides my involvement and work with social movements and political activists, the paper also draws on an analysis of emotions, discourses of political speeches, posters, media, and most significantly, the development of a labor syndicate in Lebanon. And then this last part is especially important because it's something that I didn't explore so much during the dissertation fieldwork, but it opens up political economic angles for my work that I'd like to pursue as I move into the future. So the Arabic title, the title of the talk, Bkhsu al-karameh wa al-sha'b al-anid, comes from Ziad Rahbani's play. And I'm going to talk today about on dignity, Bkhsu al-karameh, and put aside al-sha'b al-anid, which would translate, I guess, to the stubborn people, but I think Ziad is implying resilience here. And I think in this sense, maybe one could say that dignity and resilience go hand in hand, that perhaps they coexist. But I'm going to put resilience aside today. I won't be talking about that. It might be evident in the work. We could talk, maybe some thoughts might emerge as you listen to me. I'll put that aside. So let me begin. In 2011, we saw revolutionary movements sweep the Arab world in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Syria. And at the time, listening to slogans like "Irfa rasak fo inta Masri," lift your head up high, raise your head up high, you're Egyptian, which we heard elsewhere with substitutions for the country name, coupled with people's basic demands for hurriya, karameh, adala ijtimaiya, so freedom, dignity, and social justice. One notices that a key demand of the people has been karameh, or dignity. Here you see a poster, I hope you can see these well, but in red at the bottom it says 39% chose dignity. And so that the sense that, it's a bit dark. Is it, can you all see the, yeah, okay. So the sense that dignity was a choice of the path of the revolution, right? So even though the two top figures gained on their own 25%, the path of the revolution was dignity. People have been screaming this across the region and calling for a return of dignity by seizing it from the state. Most acutely in Syria, people have insisted on their revolution as one specifically for dignity with slogans like "Al-Sha'b al-Suri ma binzal," the Syrian people cannot be humiliated, and strikes in the name of dignity. So here, a poster from 2011, this is all over the internet and came out during a strike in 2011. Examples from around the region are numerous, and people are always finding new ways to subvert the humiliation of the state and its oppression by shaming it, thus putting themselves on the path to dignity. So here's an example from a few months ago you might have seen in the papers, where a farmer dresses up a pony as Abdel Fattah Sisi, the Egyptian general. In a sense, kind of repositioning this sort of humiliation that we're going to humiliate the state, and we've had enough. Of course, he gets imprisoned. I also am not sure. I've talked to people about whether this is a pony, a horse, or a donkey, but we'll leave it as it is. So what happens when we take dignity as an analytical category to think through political and political-economic mobilization? In the longer paper, I try to sort of complicate the idea of political mobilization, grassroots, independent political party, and so on. What kind of actions, encounters, and experiences might be associated with and emerge from a discourse of dignity? And what can anthropology tell us about the micro-workings of dignity, its everyday practices, embodiments, and emotions in relation to political struggle? I'm going to explore these questions today in relation to Lebanon. Dignity can technically be invested with any meaning we like, and this opens it to contestation, which in turn makes it a space for hegemonic struggle. To a large degree, what dignity means for people might be more a matter of intuition rather than based on specific scientific measures. Its intersubjective and affective emergence may be a testament to this. Debate of its usefulness are ongoing in debates of dignity's usefulness are ongoing in a variety of fields: philosophy, law, medicine, bioethics. So you get this sense of euthanasia, abortion, cloning, where you get these questions of dignity that come up. In general, this literature is looking at or focusing on the individual's dignity, the human being, the self, or the person, while recognizing that this has implications on society as a whole. In this paper, I want to shift the focus and place society and the collective in a more central role in discussions of dignity. I also don't want to argue whether dignity is a useful concept or not. Rather, I'd like to draw out some of the possibilities embedded in a discourse of dignity and what it means to invoke it in political mobilization. Its sole usefulness, for me, is derived from the fact that people imagine it in certain ways, or it's imagined for them, and are invested in fighting for it. Today, I'll begin by exploring different conceptions of dignity and how it's been articulated. I'm then going to read through Weber in a way to think about the concept of dignity as separate from honor. This step is important since honor has been given so much weight in interpretations of violence in the Mediterranean, especially related to the feud, and has been used to interpret violence in Lebanon, as Michael Johnson has done in one of his books. I'll next question the meaning of dignity and the way people use it for political struggle by reading Fanon within the present, and follow this by pointing to dignity's role as a kind of political emotion, which Ghassan Haj says gives people and their lives meaning and power. Dignity, between affect and emotion, is tied intimately to the way bodies, our bodies, the body politic, government bodies, anybody, everybody, have come to be recognized and how they relate in our present-day international system, and in the midst of international laws and norms that have sought to codify it. My argument is that the conventional and hegemonic perspectives of analytic and moral philosophy, à la Kant, and the language of rights, which posit the individual as the unit of analysis, defined by rationality, amongst other things, cannot capture the shifting meaning and practices of dignity. Ultimately, dignity is very much tied to a politics of recognition, in which those formerly unrecognized and oppressed take the question of recognition into their own hands. It's not something to be secured or guaranteed by state power, but realized through the capacities of human action and resistance. Lebanon's history of protracted conflict and political violence since independence is the environment from which I argue dignity becomes a salient demand and feeling in political life. And this is the part in my paper which is like this long, but because you all know the context, I can skip. For the concept is not really at the tip of the tongue of those who feel dignity or have it. So this is why I'm saying that it emerges from this context, and or those who perceive themselves to have stability. So, for example, one doesn't normally hear the discourse of dignity being invoked in a sort of, let's say, mainstream American culture. And sort of wailing about their dignity. It appears to be given by the state, by birth, by God, by mere existence. Dignity becomes an issue, however, for people or groups all over the world, including America. And I'm going to later talk about the Zapatistas, who are threatened, usually existentially, or who face injustice or political insecurity and, related to my work, anticipate war and instability. During my fieldwork, I could observe the discourse of dignity being invoked and actions taken in its name from different quarters. Political leaders promised it in speeches and would guarantee it to their constituents in exchange for loyalty and support. In everyday encounters, people would appeal to their dignity to show signs of strength or a will to resist. For example, one interlocutor, Michel, insisted in a conversation I had with him in June 2008 after the Beirut battles that he would not allow Hezbollah to enter his areas and would fight to the death for his dignity. This was someone who had fought during the war in Lebanon on behalf of the Christian Lebanese forces. He was in his 40s now, with 3 kids. From our conversations, it appeared that it was the political representation of the Christians that was of serious concern. Through this representation would come a better life for him and his children, and with all this, in turn, dignity. Hezbollah, because of its success repelling Israel over the years and possessing disproportionately heavier weapons, had the ability to defeat and thus humiliate the Christians as a discrete group. To stand up to Hezbollah, regardless of whether the resistance group poses a real threat or not, and to talk about fighting the group, was already a way to feel dignity, whether this was real or not. Here, I could feel dignity through the gusto and bravado in Michel's speech. "Let them dare to enter our areas, we'll kill them," he would say. Announcing that he would defend any oppression of Christians was a move to dignity, as verb, which I'll get to in a little bit, and to establish that it will not be violated. He did not even have to act out his threat to feel the sense of dignity. In this case, I would suggest it was in the same spirit of the abadai, or the shabbiha, where dignity and honor are confused, and dignity is gendered, tied as it is to preserving some form of masculine selfhood. The set of issues raised in this encounter with Michel, whether dignity related to honor, thought of as verb, or felt as affect and emotion, will be explored here shortly. One often hears karamet al-shab, dignity of the people, or karamet al-watan, dignity of the nation, appealed to as something that which must be protected and maintained. Or bidna naish bi karameh, we want to live with dignity, as that which must be fought for. As you're all most likely aware, Lebanese were inundated with a marketing campaign in 2007 that spoke to the role of dignity in political life. One faction had come up with I Love Life billboards, and months later the opposition responded with the same slogan followed by words in graffiti font, such as here, undictated or with dignity, and other words to qualify I Love Life. The use of dignity implied that some would rather die or fight rather than live for the sake of living, even if this meant insubservience. The state was not simply a guarantor of life, but had to ensure a meaningful life or some form, some manner of dignity. The discourse of dignity is certainly not limited to one faction, and one could see this in the political rhetoric across party lines. And so, here I'm talking about March 8, March 14, but within March 8, within March 14, you could see this discourse, and so this is just one example. So I want to turn now to different conceptions of dignity. In Christianity, the concept is extrapolated from various scripture to become an intimate part of Christian belief and teaching. In the Islamic texts, it's more explicit, as the word karameh is used several times. The word is translated as dignity as well as honor or honorable. And dignity is founded on the notion, similar to Christianity, that man is created in the image of God, and the God-man relationship is based on love. The Arabic word in its root, karam, relates to giving and being charitable, which seems to resonate in certain interpretations of the concept of human dignity in Western Christianity and its relations to charity. So the term seems quite similar to the English translation, with similar ambiguities in meaning. And I think this is really important because I get this question often in terms of whether the term karameh can translate to dignity, whether what's being lost linguistically when it's being carried over or not. And I'd argue that in both cases there's a lot of ambiguity of meaning, and there's a lot of crossover. So I'm in a sense keeping that kind of conflation. Modern international legal conceptions can be traced back to the concept of the dignity of man in 1486. This point is interesting because it can have two interpretations, either to think of man as all human beings or to think of it as gendered. Even when the first is implied, often there is an unconscious slippage where men's as opposed to women's priorities are considered in factoring for dignity. And so in the sort of European philosophy, Sophia's treatise of 1739, women are not inferior to man, is sort of one example of trying to articulate an equal dignity for all and decoupling it from a masculine sense. Many Egyptians, women and their allies in the political movements post-2011, have been keen to assert a dignity for all, where women's dignities are not silenced at the expense of a national dignity or national liberation. Palestinian women, as far back as the early days of the Palestinian liberation movements, voiced their calls for dignity so as not to be silenced and unconsciously subsumed into a majoritarian red masculine dignity. In Lebanon, dignity becomes gendered when, for example, political movements are silent on women's personal status laws while rhetorically talking about dignity for all. International law has taken dignity to be almost preordained and uncontestable, a kind of natural right. The UN Charter has called upon world nations to affirm faith, quote, in the dignity and worth of the human person. Actually, faith is also in the quote. Thus, preserving human dignity has become one of the pillars of our age and the basis of human rights policies. Dignity can refer to socioeconomic rights, political rights, self-determination. It can relate to autonomy and agency. It is seen as rights-based. It includes freedom, pride, liberty, independence, and can refer to a status, as in a dignitary. People may imagine one or all of these in their moments of mobilization. If dignity relates to self-determination, then the latter is itself a tricky concept. It can be a nationalist and centralized self-determination, or, like in the articulation of Syrian anarchists, it can be linked to autonomy and decentralization. So the call for dignity is not inherently progressive, and so the Lebanese case is a good example. It may need to be tied to specific forms of social justice first. As David Harvey instructs us, likely with an approving smile from Gramsci, ideologies need a conceptual apparatus that appeals to our intuitions and instincts, to our values and our desires, in order for them to become dominant. The conceptual apparatus itself would have to be embedded in common sense. Harvey tells us, quote, "The founding figures of neoliberal thought took political ideals of human dignity and individual freedom as fundamental, as the central values of civilization. In so doing, they chose wisely, for they are indeed compelling and seductive ideals," end quote. So here, concepts of dignity and freedom are manipulated, or were manipulated, continue to be manipulated, to push people and institutions to carry out specific policies that would in turn preserve the dignity and would preserve dignity and achieve freedom. But freedom was interpreted as market freedom above all, and individual freedom took precedence over the collective that was set to oppress the individual freedom to choose. So the hope in the calls to dignity in the Arab world, I suppose, is that they have focused on the collective and have been attached to specific forms of social justice, right? To try to disentangle this sort of neoliberal from the kind of calls that we might have heard at certain points coming from different parts of the Arab world. So I want to turn to the connection between honor and dignity next. And I argue that while structures of honor and shame continue into our present-day world and into Lebanon's war and its different battles, we should identify how they have changed and not overemphasize them. And in this talk, I don't define humiliation and shame, but that's another way to also think about sort of the opposite of dignity and honor. Oftentimes, humiliation is seen as the sort of corollary to dignity, or the kind of the opposite. Honor has loaded meaning in academic thought on the Mediterranean, despite attempts to correct this. It's often associated with masculine ideals, shame with the feminine. Honor has been reduced and reified and fixed in meaning and practice. Jamous characterizes honor as having certain codes of conduct that people must conform to, and that it overdetermines social relations. So one might ask, could dignity play the same negative role in understanding Arab communities that honor once did by creating a kind of essentialist and reductionist view of society and its corresponding relationship with violence? And so, anything is possible, especially if dignity is reduced to specific conditions and dispositions. But I argue that its embeddedness in a universalist, or better yet, internationalist discourse, not to confuse universal with sort of unitary or unitary applicability. And its echo across class and gender in times of crisis and struggle ensures that we do not fall into honor's gendered traps, though we must take great care not to let dignity overdetermine social, even political relations. So that's kind of my caution. In daily speech, sharaf, honor, and karameh, dignity, are indeed often used interchangeably. And I was hard-pressed to get a clear definition when I asked interlocutors in the field. The differences were felt, but hard to pin down. So I want to tease apart some of the differences to begin a conversation on the multiple meanings of dignity. A caution. Definitions can often rarefy and fix concepts, whereas I consider dignity to be very fluid. Distinctions between sharaf and karameh should also not be interpreted as being rigid. For honor is neither concrete nor constant. And dignity, being intersubjective, also means that it varies with context and remains a contested concept. My point, however, is that states and political parties are more invested in the discourse of dignity and providing people with dignity than honor. So I want to think about this by reading through Weber. At the level of formal sect and political party, and this is an important caveat here, because I don't mean at the level of people. I'm talking about the formal sort of sect and political party, because I don't want to imply that we all hate each other. Right? Lebanon can be said to follow Weber's model of ethnic coexistence, in which there is mutual repulsion and disdain between groups, but each allows the other to consider its own honor as the highest one. And I leave the definition of group open here to refer to sect, class, political party, rather than to purely ethnic and essentialist definitions, and overlook Weber's use of the term ethnic. I would argue the general principle of how they treat each other would still hold to Weber's model. The intent to annihilate the other during the 75-90 war, coupled with the principle of la ghalib la maghlub, no victor, no vanquished, which assumes all groups in the war to be equal in status of victim and perpetrator, were factors that transformed the behavior of communities. So, of course, I'm talking about in the eyes of each community. Each community thought itself to have lost from this war. Mutual disdain turned to physical violence. No one emerged as victor, and each community began to see itself as politically oppressed or as a negative social status group in Weberian terms. So I'm specifically talking here about groups in conflict situations. Weber tells us that while dignity for the privileged status group can actually come from honor bestowed on the group, the picture is different for the negative status group, or the oppressed class, who is usually shamed and has no honor bestowed on it, and thus has to reach for a sense of dignity from elsewhere. So Weber writes, and I thought this would be easier to follow, the sense of dignity of socially repressed strata, or of strata whose status is negatively, or at least not positively, valued, is nourished most easily on the belief that a special mission is entrusted to them. Their worth is guaranteed or constituted by an ethical imperative or by their own functional achievement. Their value is thus moved into something beyond themselves, into a task placed before them by God. One need not look too far to connect this definition of dignity with that found in the discourse of different Lebanese political parties. We see it when the Christian factions during Lebanon's war appealed to maintaining the existence of Christians to ensure karameh al-Masihiyya, the dignity of the Christians, and as a way to mobilize their constituents. And we see it in Hezbollah's discourse, more recently, which is loaded with the ethical imperative to resist and with the functional achievement in its struggle against Israel. In the revolutions of 2011, we also find that the ethical imperative to revolt against the state is meant to bring dignity, and in this case, to end people's humiliation. While material realities might not be immediately different, it's in the struggle for the ethical imperative where dignity is produced. Dignity, rather than simply attained by virtue of birth, power, wealth, sanctity, prestige, guile, force, all characteristics of honor, can also be acquired through techniques of action as one tries to achieve or fight for rights, freedom, power, prestige, or these other values associated with honor like respect, ihtiram. Especially in the case of negative status groups, dignity must be, as Weber says, nurtured by the belief in a providential mission. In the case of Lebanon, there is no privileged status group to have more honor. Each side perceives itself to be oppressed. Thus, dignity, while it can be related to honor, is not conditioned on it and has to be sought from elsewhere. This elsewhere could be through military might, fierceness in combat, control of land and resources, or standing ground in the face of the enemy, like the state. More generally, it can come by achieving social justice, fighting for more rights and winning some, or, in the case of neoliberal dignity, through market forces. In all cases, dignity, as Weber wrote, refers to a future lying beyond the present, whether it's in this life or of another. This is most starkly observed in the martyrdom discourse within all the communities during the war, the martyr giving his or her life for the future of the country. Most recently, when Wissam Hassan was killed, Shahid Karamat Lebanon, martyr of the dignity of Lebanon. It would seem that groups feel dignity in the act of constant struggle to attain it. I suggest that without this constancy to attain and maintain dignity, dignity's emotive power weakens, and it becomes a largely conceptual issue taken for granted, since a group cannot simply have it and hold on to it. A group's dignity is felt in the process of achieving it. This dignity, as a future lying beyond the present, seems to be nurtured by a belief that through struggle in the present, rewards will be bestowed on the community in the future. And dignity's relation to the future, in this way, can be seen as a response to instability, to the invisibilities of violence and the anticipation of war that I'm exploring in the book. It's in this sense that political discourse in Lebanon privileges karameh over sharaf. Political conflicts in the country do not simply involve a struggle over a community's political power, but also a struggle over ideological ways of living in this world. And they do this by framing their claims in terms of rights and self-determination. That honor plays and played a role in being the object of dignity cannot be ignored, but this is only one part of the story, and it is certainly no longer an honor resembling that of the old family or tribal relations, but one that depends on political, legal, and ideological factors. So I'm trying here to really think through this transition of how dignity sort of comes to play a role in politics as opposed to honor. So I want to elaborate now on the idea of dignity being produced through struggle for the ethical imperative. So in the summer of 2012, I went to a press conference of the National Press Syndicate where workers were launching the first private labor syndicate in Lebanon in at least 30 years. It was a Spinneys supermarket syndicate to fight for their rights against Spinneys management. People around me were excited and inspired to see workers empowered in a way they had not seen in a very long time, and to see a union that was forming outside the auspices of communal leaders and away from sectarian considerations. The union was later approved. They've run into a lot of trouble and internal problems and so on. But for my purposes, I want to look at this moment, the sort of initiation, the launch of this labor struggle. And you see also here people protesting alongside the protesters, talking about labor unions are your right and weapon in order to work and live with dignity. As part of the launch, there were about 6 speakers, workers employed or recently fired by the supermarket. They gave opening statements in which they recounted their miserable trials as employees of one of the largest supermarket chains in the country. Listening to their stories and the way they were denied wages and even physically humiliated, one would have the immediate inclination to see these people as victims, perhaps needing our sympathy or charity. Yet viewing them through the lens of a politics of dignity, as I'll argue, allows us to see them in struggle, as having power and being determined, resilient, and strong, deserving rather than our charity but our solidarity. All 5 speakers that day framed the priorities of the labor union in terms of a protection of their dignity, along with raising salaries, securing jobs, and providing health insurance. While dignity is perhaps the most abstract demand, it carries a strong potential for mobilization. Dignity as struggle means that these workers were building and organizing space to struggle and enshrining this space, the protection of their dignity, as a priority of the labor union. Fanon is helpful here to think of how the workers might have been using dignity. He writes that the most essential value for the colonized is land. The land, quote, the land which must provide bread and naturally dignity. But this dignity has nothing to do with human dignity, end quote. For Fanon, the land had not brought human dignity for the colonized, as all they saw was oppression. Fanon opposed national dignity to actual dignity from land, bread, and putting the country back in the hands of people. The rhetoric of national dignity, which can be conflated with human dignity, is not the human dignity of Fanon, which is one where people are able to make their country, toil their land, and have more agency over their labor. Fanon recognized that dignity as equality, for the colonized at least, was a farce, and giving existing political realities to speak in the name of a dignity for all was to equate the oppressed and oppressor, colonized and colonizer. His universal human dignity was different. It was to come from struggle, from silencing the arrogance of the colonist and breaking his spiral of violence, as he says. There's a sense here that dignity is linked to power through a deep tension. Laurie King suggests a similar interpretation among Palestinians, where dignity implies, quote, the necessity of ameliorating as much as possible the troubling hierarchical and exclusivist effects of power, end quote. Such meaning has a different resonance to the implications of dignity in the UN Charter and the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where dignity appears neutered, depoliticized, and devoid of power. The Universal Declaration enshrines the dignity of all members of the human family, and Article 1 states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Here we see the idea that all people are born with dignity. And this is universal to humans on the assumption that we are all equal in this world. Like the Christian invocation, dignity is here held sacred to all life. The Charter makes no room for a sense that we must fight for our dignity, that some people may feel in their interactions with others, other people, other governments, other communities, more or less dignity, and that dignity may have to be seized rather than guaranteed by the state in a world where people are not equal in political practice. For the crafters of the UN Charter, an intrinsic dignity with universal meaning is the ground of natural rights. There is no sense of a struggle to dignity. It's predetermined and must be protected by the state, which itself determines when dignity is violated. Such dignity, under international legal regimes, is fetishized and places human agency in the protection of the state. And while a sense of dignity lies at the heart of our understanding of human rights, the basis of dignity itself is open to interpretation. So for Fanon, dignity is not to be put in the service of tolerating each other and living together in peace with one another as good neighbors, as the UN Charter would have it, nor is dignity to be defended and guaranteed by our government. Fanon's dignity comes from a more organic place he reduces to the land, which is meant to produce not a party politics focused on electioneering and philosophical political discourse, not peace and tolerance for all, not rhetoric, but a confrontational politics and political action. Such dignity tied to land is embedded in a class concept rather than a humanistic one. In this light, some of the calls for dignity that we first observed in the Arab squares in the early days of 2011, especially accompanied with major labor mobilizations, could be seen as radical calls, and calls against the infrastructure of the security state and the dominant politics of stability, as well as against a liberal demand for basic reforms. Of course, they can be and have been manipulated and transformed for other ends. We can frame Fanon's dignity in terms of what John Holloway calls the politics of dignity, where he asks us to think about how we can put dignity at the center of oppositional thought. The politics of dignity stands apart from the politics of poverty, where the oppressed are seen as victims waiting for our charity. Instead, it sees a people in struggle. A politics of dignity recognizes that inside poverty, there is an objectified subject struggling against her own objectification, and in so doing allows us to see people in struggle. Holloway explains to us that the Zapatistas call on the people in Chiapas to dignity, to struggle. Dignity here is a verb, an action, not a state of being, but a process of becoming. It should not simply be seen as historically determined, but rather it is weaved into a people's revolutionary becoming. This too is Fanon's sense of dignity as people who are actional. We saw this in a conservative sectarian sense with Michel earlier, establishing dignity through his preemptive posture of a defense of community. It is also in this way that one can think of dignity as an affect, in that it carries potential. So the kind of the potential for things to come. Returning to the labor union in Lebanon, the workers involved in establishing the first syndicate were not only the first syndicate in decades, were not only standing up to their store managers, but to a matrix of alliances and collusions involving communal leaders, elites, and state apparatuses of power. Invoking the discourse of dignity through the labor union allowed workers to situate their own power and agency in a network of mutual support and egalitarian ties. Such a union could generate the requisite trust and solidarity to enable individuals to work together to transform the material and moral basis of their shared world for the common good of all workers. At least this is how I see the union's intent in principle, if not in practice. When the workers invoke the notion of protecting dignity in their launching speeches, it's to provide a sense that the syndicate is to exist beyond just meeting salary and insurance demands or immediate quality of life issues, but rather returning to Weber for a future lying beyond the present. It's there to protect their struggles. Such a dignity weaved into a people's revolutionary becoming, as we could see in the squares and the sacrifices in Arab countries, is one that demands radical change, the overthrow of regimes, and far more, I think, than reform. This, at least, is the original impetus in the 2011 movements as I've seen them. For the workers in Lebanon, invoking dignity meant persisting, despite being fired and beaten, to change the nature of worker relations, put a stop to humiliating conditions, and forever alter the dynamics of politics in the country, if ever only so slightly. Dignity, as I have been describing it so far, as it's not intrinsic, but contested, and left to people's imaginations about their personhood, collectivities, and futures, has an emotive value in the political sphere. Being on the order of imagination, dignity is both intrinsic to us and metaphysically or phantasmagorically somewhere up there, as it becomes a site of hegemonic contestation. Ghassan Haj defines political emotions as those emotions related to our sense of power over ourselves and our environment as we pursue those goals, ideals, and activities that give our life a meaning. And generating meaning in life, as Bourdieu argues, is perhaps one of the most significant functions of the social world. Thus, dignity as a political emotion becomes crucial to operating in this world. For dignity to perform as such an emotion defined by Haj, it would need to provide a person with power over their environment by setting up an imaginary self that is invested with a reservoir of emotions from which this person can draw on or relate to. And this self can be the sect, the nation, in our case, a labor union or some kind of unified struggle. Dignity is felt as a political emotion to the extent that one comes to identify oneself through the labor union or some other entity, which in turn gives one a sense of power over oneself and one's environment and produces a sense of meaning in a person's life. What I'm saying has implications for understanding the person protesting in the street, who arguably may not see the fruits of his or her mobilization. A regressive government may come instead in the short run, for example. Yet, dignity as a political emotion allows a person to see herself in the fantasy of a larger meaning. And what we know about fantasies is that they have a way of being more real than reality. More importantly, a move to dignity allows this person to feel secure and whole, identifying through her political and collective action, no matter the real, actual results. So I've been talking about how we think about dignity as a political emotion, giving us meaning and power over ourselves, but also about how Fanon and Holloway get us to think of dignity as struggle. In both cases, dignity is not something defined universally or intrinsic to us, but is intersubjective, escaping reification and gaining meaning through our contact and interpretation with the world around us. So, in conclusion, in an international system that conditions state legitimacy on the right to protect its citizens, dignity becomes intricately tied to notions of human security and the state's provision of protection. Here, honor has little affective or material power. The state is meant to provide us with our dignity. We demand this from it. And the call to dignity as verb has the ability to create a formidable force to rip through systemic humiliation and unbearable oppression. It can work as the current connecting people towards collectivities that can build new hegemonies and inform the common sense. We can imagine its possibilities in the labor struggle and in the potentialities of the Arab revolutions of 2011. But in order to realize these potentials, we have to first understand what we mean when we call for dignity. Because tied as it is to notions of security, it can trap us in the discourse of securitization. Dignity, never wholly a technique in the people's arsenal, can be manipulated by economic and political regimes hell-bent on controlling people's organizational potentials and in buttressing the security state. Reading dignity through Weber as a future lying beyond the present, and through Fanon and Holloway as struggle, has led me to unfold its emotional power and to think of some of the implications the concept can have for people's continued struggle against all forms of oppression. Dignity as an actional concept rather than an intrinsic, reified right can unleash isolationist, regressive, even racist potentials. Yet, it can also, and hopefully, draw people to challenge the state and to believe in an alternative politics that drives us to struggle for another moral world, for recognition, for respect and care of others, and for a reorganization of human security in less oppressive and less state-intrusive ways. But we have to uncover this dignity. explore the way it's embodied in political movements and collective action, and develop a better understanding of what dignity, as a process of revolutionary becoming, actually implies in the daily becomings of political mobilizations. And this, at least, is the dignity I've been trying to interrogate and rescue. Thank you. So I guess welcome your comments, and we have till 6, I guess.
Yeah, we have
Plenty of time.
We
Okay.
we don't need to go whole.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Sami. Actually, I'm wondering, it seems like you end up on this kind of very rosy... Sorry? Microphone. Okay, so I can speak louder. I've been lecturing the last few days. So I think you end up on this kind of very rosy, kind of revolutionary, kind of, yes, you know, let's... but I mean, what about dignity as a potential for violence? How does that kind of aspect, that, I mean, that the narrative that you gave of the militia, ex-militia member sounded more like a dignity as a kind of invocation for violence. So that's one question I had. And then the other one is it seems like kind of the idea of struggle that you are invoking seems to kind of, I'm still not very clear. You're locating struggle as part of the everyday, but I didn't really kind of get the everyday part in what you're saying. It was mostly discourse and mostly what people are narrating as what they, in their imaginary of the imagination of what dignity is. How do you see the everyday entering into this what you call the intersubjective space? So, thanks.
The first question. Invoking violence, and dignity invoking violence. Actually, this is, so I began thinking about dignity the way I started the paper with the Arab revolutions. And there I was caught in the romance. And I thought, I started thinking, well, you start to see, well, we have to support these people's movements because they're calling for dignity, right? And so, but then as time went on, and you see also different trajectories in different countries and different political groups in the different countries and where they're taking this. I mentioned this, I questioned this several times in the paper, that dignity can take regressive, can have regressive potentials. And in regressive, perhaps I could include violent potentials. Because, yes, you know, I mean, the Islamic State, Daesh, I'm sure also calls for dignity of people, right? So this is where then it actually became more productive in the sense that, so I'm trying to locate a kind of, how would we begin to think of a progressive form of dignity? What might that look like? And one of the things here I think is important in this last slide is respect and care of others. That can you think of dignity without respect for others? And if you did, what kind of violent or regressive potentials might that contribute to? So yes, certainly it invokes that, and I think that's where we need to be careful, because dignity has a kind of also rhetorical appeal to it. When you say dignity, and dignity and freedom, therefore we have to follow you. But maybe not, right? So it becomes questioning how do we translate this. The other part, locating struggle. In the longer paper, I have a moment where I am talking about a kind of encounter that I have with someone who's lost his brother in fighting with Hezbollah in 2006, and I read that encounter when I meet this person, and he basically sort of smiles at me and says Allah yarhamu, and he's fine, and I'm really sort of caught up in this, not knowing what to do and sort of ashamed. Anyway, it's a long. I didn't put it in because it's kind of long, but it was also a bit problematic, so I'm still working through it. But trying to understand this. Reading this intersubjective as dignity as opposed to something else, is also something that I'm trying to think through, because what happens when you deal with any affect, it becomes problematic in the social sciences, because you don't know what to do with it, and you have 10 people in a room and 10 people will interpret this affect differently, and so because it's so highly interpretable, it becomes I'm needing to sort of look at this. So when you think of struggle in everyday, trying to think of struggle in everyday life, I'm also trying to think of the connection between affect and struggle in everyday life. And so what does it mean to read dignity in a certain situation? Because and this dignity in this case, this person, I know his past, I know that he's a supporter and once upon a time part of Hezbollah, and so I know that he derives some worth and value and so on from connection to Hezbollah and the fact that his brother's death, and so that gives him strength. And at that moment, so I'll reveal, I'm in BO18, and I'm feeling part of this community of people that we say partied during the 2006 war, so on and so forth. And so I'm standing opposed to this person who's there, he's not partying, he's working, right? So so basically trying to read this as dignity versus something else, and his struggle as dignity, because he's not telling me, Sami, I'm bkhsu karameh, he's not telling me he feels dignity. I'm reading it, and a lot of times in daily struggle and daily, people aren't carrying necessarily, they're not using the word karameh, they might be using other words, right? And there's also different words that stand in, like aiz, like even shut off. But thanks for the question, because it sort of forces me to think of that the concept of struggle in every day, because you're right, it doesn't come out here. Yeah.
Thanks, Sami. That was really interesting. Great paper. I want to take you to the literature on political philosophy, because in some ways the discussion about dignity brings you to populism, where there is always the problem of what is the people. And I want you to think a little bit, because you end by a very cautionary note that the people can sometimes ask for security. The people can sometimes become racist, And then to Omar's question, you said the care of others, in a way, can inoculate the people from being stupid if they care for others. The problem is how people define others and who is themselves. There's a tension I want you to talk about in your paper between the excitement you felt with the syndicate, which is a certain kind of people, and the people in general. Because those are different kinds of appeals to dignity. One is an appeal to dignity as a worker, forming a collective. The other is an appeal to dignity as the people. There's that tension in your paper. I want you to share that with us a little more.
Good question. It's true, because I trying to, the people are the people in the squares who are calling for dignity. Also, gets us into the question of who are these people, and the question of sort of politicizing the category of the people in ways that the labor union defines in much more sort of more concretely in terms of a class struggle, and ties dignity to certain material demands within a certain class, right? Whereas when the people go into the streets, they come with different class backgrounds. So the trouble with speaking conceptually of how dignity is used amongst broad categories of people is that it's also in rhetoric as an affect in political mobilization, it's speaking for all of us. So when the Egyptians go into the street and they call for dignity, you can ask 1,000 people in the squares what actually they mean, and you'll get different answers. But what I'm trying to bring out in this paper is that there is an affective appeal to this, the dignity. Forget what it might actually mean if we sit down and develop a political ideology or develop demands for this. That in itself it has a kind of affect, whether it's with the labor union or amongst broad swaths of people. I think there's something interesting in what you say is that might be also the idea of that respect is somehow supposed to save people. It might be too easy to say that respect for others might save people from a kind of dignity that might otherwise go astray. The question always is how to define. But again, when we're talking about collectivities, no matter how much we want to complicate the collectivity and how much we want to, I'm an anthropologist at the end of the day, and looking at within those collectivities and bringing out the sort of complexities, there's a homogenizing aspect to political mobilization within these collectivities. That dignity kind of embraces all these people against, let's say, another people. I don't know. I'm just talking out loud here because the question is.
If dignity means everything to everyone, how on earth can it be useful as a struggle, as a category in political struggle?
Yeah. So this is, I began by saying that, the debates about dignity center, in some cases, especially some of the philosophical debates, center around whether dignity is a useful concept or not. Is it an empty signifier? But I think the reason I want to focus on it is, like I said, it's important to the people who are using it, and it's being used by people in various mobilizations. And so I think there's like hope, like sovereignty, like freedom. So especially something like hope, which is also studied, or sovereignty, which can mean many things. I think it's I find it useful to interrogate it. To try to understand what people are trying to bring out, and it's possible at the end of the day that the conclusion for all this is, in fact, people's movements, there is really no impact of using this dignity. But I'd argue that it has an affective value, that it mobilizes people emotionally. And so what is going on there is my question. Sorry.
Actually, for me, dignity is like Islam is a solution. I mean, anyone can use it. Or peace. By the way, you can see, for instance, Israelis use a lot the word peace. At the same time, they support settlement, but they are in favor of peace. So really, maybe this concept, as it is so slippery, should be very localized and grounded to give it some meaning. But my question now: do you find ideologically among the different art ideologies more, for instance, used among nationalists than communists, leftists, Islamists? I mean, do you see any variations here?
So Number of things. First, I think that dignity is, that all these different ideologies are using dignity, these political groups are using dignity. I agree 100% that it's, and I say this, that it must be contextualized, that dignity is very contextual, highly contextual, and I mean, to the point that it's, you know, again, intersubjective, but let's say contextual, so I kind of switch back and forth. There is this tension where I'm going Arab world and then I'm going Lebanon. But I do want to stress that it is contextual. I think, you know, the concept of peace or Islam, we don't get rid of peace or Islam because people can use it in different ways. You know, you want to sort of rescue the idea of peace from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that, you know, peace might be oppressive, right? Peace might be, you know, be used as a cover for settler colonialism, right? But so then the struggle is to redefine peace as a cover for settler colonialism. And I think with dignity, it's being used in these ways, and because it has that appeal, and that people follow this, you know, the kind of visceral that people want dignity. And I think it's important to bring the conversation from the philosophical realm to the realm of politics, and have that conversation about dignity in the political realm, where it's previously been at the philosophical, especially the individual, and thinking about it as, you know, a collective, and having that debate.
I'm just going to insert my questions, then we can go back to the floor, because it kind of follows from that. I have two questions I was thinking about. I mean, one is about dignity. One is about dignity, and I think about, does it have to be in relationship to something, to something that a gaze, an institution, something that's robbing dignity of people, you know, have dignity in relationship to that. And so I wonder the question, can you attain or gain or feel dignity despite the continuing existence of that thing that is robbing it from you? And I think of this, you know, as a form of kind of weapons of the weak. Or I think about Nelson Mandela in prison, maintained a certain dignity in the way he you know, by reports about the way he carried himself. But the thing robbing him of his dignity, you know, existed until there was a structural change. So he had dignity, but so, I mean, are you looking basically at this dignity as like how it becomes mobilized into the social movement? So it's maybe not dignity in itself, it's kind of a tool to look at social mobilization. The second question is sort of related, I mean, which is broader, is it also follows from this contextualization. You know, in what way is your presentation about this concept of dignity, or more particular, the way it's been mobilized within, let's say, the period of Arab uprisings, or something like that, even though all these things connected are this mini stripe that connects them. And to what way are you saying something about the Arab world, this moment of the Arab world, or something more general about affect and political mobilization? Is there something that's contributing to one's understanding? I know you skipped, you know, the contextualization part because people are familiar with this context. But I was wondering if you were thinking, stepping back, who would read this paper? What would they get from it? How much is it saying something about the Arab world? How much is it saying something about the way to look at political mobilization and the role of affect, or something like that?
Yeah, no, I think that the work stems out of trying to, it stems out of a critique of Michael Johnson's work, All Honorable Men, where he kind of lays out the Civil War as a battle between people's honors. And me noticing that actually in the political discourse, people are talking about dignity. And so it begins there, very much related to Lebanon, but then also thinking about the Mediterranean and an honor discourse, and what happened to this honor discourse, and what dignity is doing. That was before 2011. So then 2011 happens, and I'm trying then to think about this and I noticed the early, like Tunisia and stuff, it was dignity kept coming up, and I was like, wow, this is really salient, this concept. And so, and there's a development, because the thing is that this discourse of dignity is sort of historically, and it'd be nice to see someone trace this historically. But I know, for example, the Wafd Party in Egypt in 1919 is using it in their claim against the British. But it's not, it'd be interesting to see when this sort of makes it into political discourse. Because one of the arguments is that because it becomes embedded in international law, and the United Nations, that then there's also this need to appeal to the international, right? Like this global, so people can understand also your claims and frame it in terms of rights and so on. There is a sense of trying to speak regionally, but also wanting to contextualize it locally. The issue of dignity in relation to something, on one hand, I want to say yes, for sure, like that it has to be in relation to something. But also, I would caution that there are many different ways also, perspectives, right? So Mandela is a good point. Mandela could have individual dignity in the way he stands up to the prison guard, right, and in the way that he's standing up to the apartheid regime, but not have sort of collective dignity because he's living in an apartheid regime, and then but there is some sense of dignity at the same time being produced through that struggle against the apartheid regime, right, and there's a sense that I'd argue that once apartheid falls, those black South Africans who are in an economically privileged position, so they're not facing economic apartheid, would no longer be concerned with dignity, right? I mean, again, they have it, it's guaranteed by the state, it's guaranteed by the system. It no longer has a kind of affective, emotional, mobilizational factor to it. So that it's also dignity in relation to insecurity, instability, the kind of violence that produces this affect in a sense.
Sami, I agree that dignity is, rather than democracy or human rights, is the right concept to understand what's going on. But I'm a bit disturbed about the example you gave of that worker that you encountered with that worker when you were not running. This worker was not talking about dignity, he was talking about family honor. And I think there's a difference between family honor and dignity in this case.
So this is why I didn't include it, because I've talked about this case, and each time there's there's a bit of a reaction. Besides the fact that someone could interpret it differently, there is also you raise a good point that it could be family honor. Now, I would argue that it's not family honor because it is tied to the political international sphere. Like this is it's not that Hezbollah just the brother's death produces honor for the family, but I'd argue also dignity in the sense that it's connected to a larger agenda, to a larger struggle, a larger cause that brings existence, as a Lebanese in Lebanon and so on. So the slippage between dignity and honor is something that when I first started this work, I thought, hey, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to define honor and dignity, and I'm going to make a breakthrough as these two separate concepts. And then as I started to analyze this, I was like, okay, great, this is not possible. There's a lot of slippage. And so, you know, and I would ask people here in Lebanon, you know, what does sharaf mean? And sometimes they'd say karameh, you know. So there is a slippage. You could be feeling honor and karameh, and I'm trying to continue to work through this example, or maybe I might ditch this example altogether and look for something a little bit that you know actually makes more sense.
Yeah, well, thank you for the definition, but one of my main problems over years of teaching was to define dignity in the classroom with students. And it was always very difficult. It was much easier to come with answers for questions like what is lack of dignity. Then you get a lot of examples. And many of the students did that, and they asked service drivers and people, what is lack of dignity? And invariably, the answers came not about human rights nor civil rights, but lack of animal rights. In fact, when human beings are deprived in their food, shelter, this was, for them, this was humiliation, this was lack of dignity. You know, and examples like, you know, struggling for bread or for minimum salaries or things like that. So I'm wondering whether in the masses, the concept of dignity is simply survival. And while the leaders use slogans in different ways, for the majority of the people it comes the same, aish, or I mean, if it's bread or it's karameh, at the end of the day maybe it's the same thing. So I don't know whether they're communicating correctly with their constituencies. I mean, if people are hungry really at the end of the day, for them dignity becomes totally something else. So it's worth pursuing the negative approach and seeing what kind of feedback one would have in Lebanon. I'm talking about what concepts of Kantian dignity or anything like that. Yeah.
In fact, there's a really interesting work that basically begins exactly what you're saying, that instead of trying to, because a lot of the philosophical work has centered around trying to understand the positive values of dignity. And so what these people, it's an edited volume, the author's last name is Lebec, and what he does is actually look at the negative values. So dehumanization, humiliation, the different kind of oppressions, to then try to make a point of what is dignity through its absence, let's say, through its absence, and maybe their argument is perhaps it's easier to define indignity. I don't know if there is partly survival, but it's not enough to have just food and shelter, right? Because then they tell you, well, this is what animals get, and you want more. I mean, Hezbollah is a good example, for example, that in trying to, I mean, it's not defending, you know, okay, yes, in a sense, it's about survival, food and shelter, but it's also a lot more than that, or at least maybe you can say survival, but then the question is, how do we define survival, and what are the conditions that would meet people's survival? Would it be enough to just give them food and shelter? How much food? What kind of shelter? And so the idea of survival in itself, survival with inequality. So they can have food and shelter, but I'm going to have a villa, and so then you get into inequality and the case of the indignity that comes with that.
Thanks, Sami. I have to open it. Sorry, I think my voice is. Anyway, I just have a quick question. I had many questions. Your thought made me think in many directions, but hearing you answer the questions, I have something simple. You mentioned at one point in your talk that you tried to combine some form of how do people use the concept, or how is it done through fieldwork. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the methodology through which you're conducting the research for this book.
So it's not. So this is an article. It's not a book project. It comes out of the dissertation and post dissertation sort of thinking about this. But and I was saying is that it's. I've been looking at political speeches, the media, and also sort of work with political groups, activists, and the kind of discourse that's being used. So and then partly I'd like to take this further with the labor union and try to think through more with them on this issue. But so the methodology was really on multiple levels. It's my ethnographic fieldwork with movements, just observing political speeches and media analysis.
All the political movements in Lebanon?
No, just no. I mean, it's been sort of general. Yeah, I didn't set out to look at a specific movement. So I wasn't thinking of it in terms of mapping ideology and dignity. And that's why, for example, studies question whether it's used in. I mean, different political parties have used it, right? And it's been used in different locations as well. And so I didn't set out to, it wasn't sort of limited in terms of, I'm going to just look at the political speeches of one or two political parties. It's been more of sort of perusing the media and looking at how, perusing the media, but also sort of being attuned and attentive to the movements and what they're saying, and working with these movements in Lebanon. And,
So I think your hand is up before.
Thank you, Sami. Yes. Sorry. I'm a little puzzled about the paper as a whole, because if you take a big word like that exists, as you said in the beginning, and it exists in international law, it exists at a whole variety of places, and then where does one go from that? And and it made me think of other attempts to do that. Rita Jacquemin had a project in which she asked Rita Jacquemin in the West Bank, the Institute of Public Health, had a project, and I read the results of asking Palestinian youth in Palestinian this and Palestinian that, what karameh meant to them. And it produced all kinds of nice responses, but in a sense, I didn't quite know where it was, whether it had added much, except in the sense of a certain kind of demand, rather, as our colleague had just said about asking students in the class. But then I thought, well, an interesting case is Hizb al-Karameh. I mean, what was the history that Hizb al-Karameh called itself Karameh? I mean, I remember sitting in meetings in Cairo and, being so proud to have a button of this, and I don't know how many years ago this all is. But whenever you take, to try to organize something around a kind of term that allows both individual action, legal claims, and having a kind of philosophical, and then the X and Y, invoking it at a moment, seems very difficult. It's at that level. Whereas if you take a particular case and then look how people are, and here we go to the sort of basic terms and how you define what a word means. And you yourself were doing it. People define their words one against the next. in a context. So you were doing that, and then it becomes interesting, okay? How someone uses the word in relationship to shut up. And it's also interesting why your trade union, I mean, I'm giving a lecture rather than a question here, but how in the trade union, yes, of course, I mean, that's a particular form of politics within which the claim, the fact that labor unions are not legal, okay? And so, I mean, that they're illegal, that you're trying to organize against the law is exactly within that space where you will invoke the various, and therefore it's interesting to analyze their discourse and how they're using the word. But in the abstract, to start from the word as opposed to a particular situated moment, whether it's karameh, I mean, even somebody as gifted as Rita Jacquemin, I didn't think it really quite worked asking everybody what it means. Whereas if you take an action where it's being evoked alongside other words, then you can see how that particular word mobilizes, achieves a charge, it seems to me. Anyway, sorry, I'm going too long.
No, thank you. I think, you know, as I working through this, the more I started thinking about the labor union, the more I'm also seeing kind of what you're saying, right? But I still think there's a value, one, in sort of trying to deconstruct the notion first, and two, in trying to think about some of the sort of trajectories and overlaps with honor as a kind of first step of theorizing the concept. And I think I feel a different way than it has been theorized. But then I think a necessary step is to really continue with that, with the labor union, and to sort of focus in. And think through that particular case, and because one of the issues, you know, that you're raising comes up in just even what do I mean by political mobilization, right? Like that spans a whole, like all kinds of things, and I sort of just tack on political mobilization. So I think. And in the paper, I acknowledge this, and there's a kind of long footnote about, what kinds of political mobilizations exist. Why am I how am I focusing on this? But if, again, focusing on a particular case, one will, I think, contextualize it more. I say it's contextual, but it'll do more to contextualize. But also, it can. Sort of focus in on, as you're saying, a specific.
Thank you for your presentation or conference. I feel that I have the feeling that I'm getting out of here with this like diagram in my head. So we're talking about contextualization and stuff, and then we're talking about like primary needs, so food, shelter, security, and then. Like higher above that, there's the political need, like in the Arab Spring and Lebanon. And then I think about Europe, that's way far away from this political need because they're more or less stable. So they have this social appeal to define dignity, like the social coloring, if you want. So can you see a vision of it like steps? Like history, like sometimes you say it's circular or spiral or whatever, so can it be like kind of this way?
No, I wouldn't want to put a kind of sort of ladder to this, because I think that this can all overlap, and it's not, necessarily that one may come before or after, they might come together. So I wouldn't want to think of it in those terms, because we have the we tend to want to sort of simplify things and kind of put things in a kind of framework so that we can grasp onto that. And I'm still, I think, in a place with this that, you know, I think it's, like I was saying, highly interpretable, and it's still something people are trying to also sort of grasp in its meaning and so on. So I wouldn't want to put a ladder to it.
But like for the generation, for like when I see my parents, they're still in this post-war vision, you know, of like this against that, and how are they, who's answering who, and who's talking on the television. I'm more like, how are we rebuilding the roads, and how are we seeing stuff socially, and who are we voting for, and what is this mass? So I kind of feel like there is this generational gap, and most of the generation might be still hung up on the post-war, but we're seeing some new, like fresh people who are thinking very differently about this.
But okay, so the thing is, though, that they're hung up, I would say my response to that, I guess, would be that they also have legitimate sort of grievances or suffer from very legitimate concerns and issues, right? And so, you know, I wouldn't want to sort of consider ourselves, you know, better than them, right? We're dealing with different issues and trying to arrive at political, social solutions from different angles, perspectives. You might think is better than theirs, but again, it's not this kind of hierarchy, or, you know, there's this like ladder of progress.
Okay, Sami's had a long day, so we're going to wrap up pretty soon. But we have Libya. If you want to, can we take all the questions now? And then we'll...
Thank you, Sami. Thank you for your paper. So you started your paper with connecting dignity to the image of the Abadai and the image of the Shabiat al-Nizam. And then you sort of ended with dignity in class struggle and dignity in the struggles of the union. And I just wanted to know how you see those connected and how you see them different.
Yeah, I mean, they are different. Of course, they're different. Again, it goes back to what Vijay was saying. Like, one is a class struggle, one is something else, and this is, you know, perhaps again the issue of speaking about political mobilization as a sort of catch-all phrase but the reason I sort of try to include this broad scope is because I'm trying to speak to the kind of affective power of dignity rather than in this paper speaking to the specific case. And going back to what Martha's saying, like so I feel that, and this is sort of why I'm talking about the revolutions and a sort of political economic struggle, a class struggle, and you know, kind of throwing this sort of broad, giving this broad scope of things, because I feel that there is an affective kind of work that's going on that's present in all these cases, differently, but that's present. And so the first task is for me to want to recognize that and then maybe sort of focus in. But yes, there is a difference.
We have two last questions.
Okay, so because I'm doing research on Syrian refugees right now, so I have a question related to that. Because we were talking about dignity as a means of political mobilization. So I'm wondering, how do we understand that in the context of a refugee crisis? When we look at people who are deprived of their basic means of survival, and when we look at different political parties and religious groups working on the ground with these people, do you think by providing them with material goods or like social services, these groups, political or religious, they can establish a certain kind of sense of dignity among the people that they are helping with, or shift their sense of dignity to material means? And what's the relationship between this material basis and the more ideological, abstract layer of dignity?
I think that's an excellent question to bring up, and relates to the survival thing, because here you would see, for example, that I think it's not enough to give refugees food and shelter, right? That part of the call for, dignified life and so on would be also the political solution, right? And the kind of political solution that might form from this. So, what does it mean for yes, sure, they might live and have good days and have bad days, because now they have, they're not worrying as much about food and shelter. But as a group, as a collective, what have we provided dignity without, let's say, a political solution in this case? And so this here would sort of force us to think about the kind of political solution that would provide dignity. I mean, look at the Palestinian refugees, for example, right? In Syria, for example, they were much better off than in Lebanon, right? So they had their food and shelter, but still the call for dignity and return, associated with return, becomes really important in this case.
Okay, the very last question. This is the second talk he's given today, so.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. I would like to ask you something now. I like your examples a lot. They connect to politics in Lebanon. But the examples are kind of an age group that's a bit old, an older generation. I would think about the new generation, which is basically me and my friend, and everyone of us around us. The new generation would like to participate in politics, but we see a big part of it has renounced its Lebanese political allegiances, if you want, you may say. This renunciation makes us feel as not committed to any political party, but still as young people, feeling a lack of power, you may say, and a lack of dignity. Dignity not by survival, we eat and sleep well, but dignity as in we don't feel like we're allowed even to reach power, because we have goals that aren't related to our ethnicity or whatever other goals or older generation has set. And by the time the older generation is gone, some of us will most probably have to reach these chairs they hold right now. How will our dignity be reflected once the younger generation, the one that's renounced its current political allegiances, how will it express its thing on a booming basis?
That's a good question. I'll start by saying I don't know. I think this goes back to contextualizing what it means to have dignity in Lebanon, and in a sense creating the sort of political platform that might position you to speak to a broad swath of people where you're connecting what you're calling dignity with what they're asking for, right? And by maybe saying, you know, this dignity that you supposedly think you're receiving from, you know, allying yourself with other political parties is not real or something. But so long as you and your friend and your other friends and me, I consider myself in your generation, so long as we are individuals, not part of a collective process, and thinking of this collectively together to create a political platform, you know, with demands and so on, then it's just that. We're, you know, individuals. We might have dignity because we sleep well and we go to AUB and we have a good education. So we have that worth. But that's not enough, right? You're saying. And that's what, and that's the thing. We don't, you know, we're supposedly equal, but we're not. You know, so I think this is where the trying to translate this emotional feeling that you don't have, you know, you don't feel you have dignity, even though you go to AUB and so on, into a political platform, or sort of with demands that are not as maybe abstract, that actually, you know, connect. Again, you have dignity, which is maybe going back to the fact that it's an empty signifier and kind of actually filling it up with meaning, which I think why it's useful is because people have filled it up in different ways with meaning. So it's not an empty concept for these people. It might feel empty in philosophical conversation, but I think that for me it is not empty for those people who are mobilized, you know, and that's just one demand, of course, right? It wasn't, you know, Shab al-Masri, you know, rising up bas lal-karameh, right? It was al-karameh wal-harriya, right? So, yes.
Okay, well, we can end there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's been a long day. And we had 2 talks, and we had an hour of questions. Yeah. And I think here, you get an audience that like knows the topic, you know, like they know the topic.